In the dead of winter, 1877, the forests of North Carolina held their breath. Snow pressed against the eaves of a lonely cabin, wind rattling the thin glass like a warning no one dared hear. Inside, a young mother's labor had stretched into the unrelenting hours of night, her body trembling beneath quilts soaked with cold sweat. The midwife, seasoned by decades of mountain births, leaned close, hands steady but mind racing. She had delivered twins before. She had buried infants before. But what she was about to see would fracture every expectation, every instinct she carried. From the mother emerged two infants, their foreheads fused in a single grotesque crown, the curve of bone forming an illusion of three separate faces. The father, chopping firewood just hours earlier, dropped his axe as though the world itself had yanked it from his grasp. The infants gasped, sometimes together, sometimes apart, their cries weaving a discordant rhythm that filled the cabin and seeped into the hills. It was not the ordinary cry of new life. It was a sound layered with something uncanny, a signal the old families in the hollow recognized as a warning. The midwife crossed herself, though she had long abandoned superstition. The father's knuckles whitened as he gripped the table, fear coiling through him like iron. Outside, the mountain whispers already swelled. The neighbors had noticed the mother's swelling in recent months. Some muttered of curses, of sins passed through bloodlines, punishment visited not upon one, but an entire hollow. And now proof lay in their swaddled bundles. The midwife wrapped the infants quickly, instinct battling despair, while the father turned away, pressed against the wall as if it could hold back the future that had just entered the room. This night would mark more than a birth. It would ignite a conflict between devotion and fear, between mercy and judgment that would sweep through the valley like wildfire. Families, ministers, and neighbors, everyone who had ever measured life in acres or harvests, would soon convene in silence and in whispers, deciding the fate of children they could barely comprehend. Before we descend further into this hidden chapter of history, pause. Subscribe now so you never miss the truths history tried to bury. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this story within you. Leave a note of your town, your hollow, your place in the world, because every voice matters against the weight of silence. Outside, the snow pressed down on the roof. Inside, the cabin held the first breaths of two beings whose very existence would haunt the mountains for decades to come. The air was cold yet thick with something heavier, anticipation, dread, and the promise that what had begun here would not stay hidden for long. By dawn, the valley was awake, though none had slept. The cries of the fused twins had traveled far, curling through the hollows and over frozen streams, touching every ear in still water. Some heard the sound themselves, others caught only fragments, passing them along like dark rumors that grew heavier with each telling. The children were no longer mere infants. In the imagination of the townsfolk, they were a warning, a sign, a shadow cast across the moral order of the hollow. Men muttered about divine retribution, women whispered of curses carried through blood, and children peeked from behind frozen windows, daring each other to glimpse the unnatural. Inside the cabin, the mother clutched her swaddled twins with a ferocity that defied exhaustion. Her body shivered, fevered, but her mind clung to a single, unbending truth. These were her children, not monsters, not warnings, not punishments. The father, however, felt the weight of every gaze he imagined beyond the walls. His shoulders bent under the invisible pressure of judgment, of expectation. He could feel the mountains themselves leaning in, watching as though the trees carried the memory of sins older than any living man. The midwife, still trembling, cleaned what little blood remained on the floorboards. She had seen deformity before, yes, but never a fusion so complete, so precise, so grotesquely beautiful. In the infants' faces, she saw both innocence and accusation, a duality that made her stomach turn and her heart ache simultaneously. She knew the parents were unprepared for what was coming. In this valley, the strange and the malformed were not met with wonder. They were met with suspicion, with fear, and eventually with action. Even before breakfast, whispers had coalesced into counsel. Men would gather at the general store, and women would exchange glances over braided rugs and worn kettles. The preacher's sermon would shape the coming decisions. The doctor's cold observations would give them language to act. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying ice across the ridge and rattling the cabin like a drumbeat for an unseen army. Every shadow seemed to lean in toward the door, as if impatient for the first step of judgment. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to mark that you are here, bearing witness. And if you have not yet, subscribe now, because in the holler, silence is complicity and knowledge is survival. In the mother's eyes, there was neither doubt nor fear, only resolve. She whispered to the infants, tiny syllables meant to anchor them to life, to love, to their humanity, even as the world outside whispered of doom. But fate was already stirring. In still water, the notion of mercy was fragile, and the valley's definition of normal was narrowing. Every heartbeat, every cry, every breath these children took would ripple outward, forcing every witness to choose, protect or condemn, see or deny. And in that choice, the valley would reveal the truth about itself and about the darkness it could not name. By midday, still water had transformed. The valley, usually quiet under snow, now hummed with the weight of expectation. Doors were cracked open, eyes peeking through frost-laced windows, ears straining for another echo of the twins' cries. Rumors had begun their work, twisting the infants into symbols heavier than their fragile bodies could bear. Some said the children carried not two, but 3 souls, a spirit trapped between the flesh, a curse that would claim anyone who dared show mercy. Others whispered of old forest spirits, of revenants that traveled the hollows every century, marking the living for punishment. And in every telling, the children's faces. 3 heads fused unnaturally, grew sharper, stranger, more impossible. Inside the cabin, the mother labored under exhaustion, rocking the twins in her arms, murmuring stories of the world they might never see. She spoke of rivers and trees, of fireflies flickering in warm summer nights, of the birds that returned each spring no matter the frost. Each word was a tether to life, a defiance of the creeping dread beyond the walls. The father, silent and rigid, kept watch at the window, sensing judgment pressing down upon them. His eyes traced the footprints in the snow, the figures pausing near the edges of his property. Men whispered to one another in low voices, forming a council in the back of the general store, debating what mercy meant and how to enforce it. The midwife moved carefully, tending the twins with trembling hands. Every pulse, every breath, every tiny whimper was a reminder that the children were alive. Yet even she, with decades of births behind her, could not shake the unease curling through her chest. The cabin felt smaller, the walls heavier, the air thick with something that was neither cold nor warm, but waiting. She looked to the father, saw the way his jaw tightened, and understood that his silence was a wall between what was and what might come. As the day waned, a shadow fell across the hollow. The preacher arrived, cloak dusted with snow, eyes dark with purpose. He did not knock, did not announce himself. He merely stepped into the cabin, the air bending around him, and spoke in a voice that carried both calm and command. "The children are signs," he said. "Not merely of what has been, but of what must be corrected." His words carved into the father's chest like cold iron. The mother turned her gaze to him, defiant even in her weakness. Before he departed, he left a reminder for all who would listen: subscribe to know the secrets they do not want unearthed. Leave your town in the comments and mark your place in the world, because these truths are not safe in silence. Outside, the snow began to fall heavier, pressing down on the valley, muffling distant sounds, yet amplifying the weight of what had begun. In still water, the line between protection and condemnation was already blurring. And in the cabin, 2 tiny hearts beat together and apart, unaware that every breath they took was reshaping the world around them. By the time evening descended, the valley itself seemed to lean closer, listening. Smoke curled from chimneys, but even the warmth of hearths could not drive away the cold unease that had settled over still water. Families huddled together, speaking in hushed tones of the children with fused heads, their minds straining to reconcile innocence with something the mountains had never produced before. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across snow-laden paths, bending toward the cabin as though the world itself were conspiring to witness what the valley could not allow. Inside, the mother held the twins like precious artifacts, whispering lullabies that twisted and echoed through the dim room. Each sound carried a defiance of the fear that had begun to saturate the air. The father paced near the window, lantern in hand, tracing the distant figures who paused near the edges of his land. They whispered among themselves, their voices carrying the rhythm of judgment, a decision forming not from law, but from instinct, tradition, and mounting terror. The midwife, exhausted and pale, moved between the infants and their parents, murmuring words of reassurance she scarcely believed. She had seen life claw its way back from death, and yet this birth defied every lesson she had learned. There was no natural order here, only the uncanny, only the overlap of innocence and horror. And as she looked at the mother, she understood the gravity of their isolation. The valley would not remain indifferent for long. Beyond the cabin, men had convened at the general store. The preacher's sermon had primed them, his words sharpening fear into action. They debated quietly but with certainty. Mercy, one said, may mean something different for these children. Another murmured, if we wait, the world will mock us, curse us, and perhaps they themselves will suffer beyond reckoning. Every argument circled the same unspoken question: what is owed to life when life itself is unnatural? Type, the veil is broken, twice in the comments now to anchor yourself in the witness of this story. And subscribe if you have not, for every chapter reveals the truths that history buried in shadow. By naming your place in the world, you take your part in observing what no one else dared. Night deepened. Lanterns flickered across the ridge. Figures passed quietly along frozen trails, gathering in the hidden corners of the hollow. Their conversation was deliberate plotting. Outside, the wind carried the faint, overlapping cries of the twins, a sound that threaded through the woods, down the creeks, and into the hearts of all who listened. It was a cry that demanded recognition, demanded reaction. In still water, the choice between protection and condemnation was no longer abstract. It was imminent. And in the cabin, two fragile bodies clung to life, unaware that each breath they drew was stirring forces far beyond the reach of their mother's arms. The following morning, the air in still water was taut, like a wire stretched beyond its limit. Word of the twins had traveled faster than frost over the ridge, and now the valley's judgment pressed upon the cabin like a physical weight. The preacher returned, this time accompanied by 3 elders, men whose names carried authority in every hollow. Their footsteps crunched on frozen ground, deliberate, measured, each echoing through the woods like a warning. Inside, the mother held the twins closer, her arms trembling but unbroken. The father hovered near the hearth, hands buried in pockets, eyes darting between the approaching figures and the fragile bundles he had yet to comprehend. The preacher spoke first, his voice calm but edged with certainty. "These children are not ordinary," he said, letting the words hang. "They are signs. They carry burdens that the valley cannot ignore. And though love may protect them, duty must guide us." His gaze cut across the room, locking with the father's, the weight of expectation pressing on his shoulders. The elders remained silent, but their presence was a chorus of quiet menace, a reminder that the law of the hollow was spoken in whispers and deeds, not statutes. The father opened his mouth, then closed it. Words failed him. The mother, pale but resolute, lifted her head. "They are mine," she said, voice trembling yet firm. "Do not touch them. Do not decide their lives for me. They are not omens. They are children." The preacher's eyes narrowed, a faint flicker of annoyance passing across his face. "Mercy," he replied, "is not always in keeping life. Sometimes mercy is in protecting them from the world, and protecting the world from them." Outside, shadows pressed against the cabin walls. The midwife, standing silently in the corner, clenched her apron. She had long believed that medicine and instinct were shields against fear. But here, logic and faith collided, leaving only the raw power of belief. Every word spoken in that room was a brick in a wall, building a structure of control that threatened to trap the infants before they had even breathed fully. Before the meeting ended, pause. Subscribe now, if you have not, to follow this tale in its entirety. Leave a comment with your location. Let the valley know that someone somewhere is watching, bearing witness to the unseen. The council departed with a final warning, their shadows lingering long after their boots had disappeared along the snow. Inside, the mother kissed the twins' foreheads, murmuring promises she was unsure the world could honor. The father, hands clenched, realized he was no longer merely a man protecting his home. He was a man confronted by the full force of an entire community's fear. And somewhere beyond the ridge, the hollow held its breath, waiting to see whether mercy, defiance, or dread would claim the hearts of those left behind. As the days passed, the cabin became a fortress of tension. Outside, still water hummed with speculation, each household a silent jury observing from behind frost-smeared windows. Men whispered at the edges of their fields, women exchanged glances at water pumps, and children tiptoed along hidden paths, daring each other to glimpse the strange twins. The valley's curiosity was insatiable, but beneath it all lay fear. Fear sharpened into something more deliberate than mere gossip. The children had become a living symbol of the valley's fragility, a test of how far their society would bend when confronted with the unnatural. Inside, the mother's days were a blur of feeding, rocking, and protecting. Every cry from the twins threaded through her nerves, making her pulse quicken with both love and dread. She whispered lullabies older than the mountains themselves, songs passed down by her mother, and her voice wove a delicate shield around the children. The father, meanwhile, patrolled the edges of the property, scanning the woods for movement. His hands ached from constant readiness, his mind a battlefield where love, fear, and guilt clashed endlessly. He could feel the weight of eyes, not just neighbors, but something older, something patient, watching from the trees, from the frozen hollows, from places that had always been there but never noticed until now. The midwife, too, carried her own burden. She had delivered countless lives, yet none so scrutinized, none so feared. She observed the twins closely, noting every movement, every tiny breath, every irregular cry. In her journal, she began recording observations in meticulous detail, not only for posterity, but because the very act of recording was a lifeline against the growing dread. Science, she reasoned, could preserve the truth against superstition, could hold back the tide of fear that threatened to drown the family in judgment. By nightfall, the first whispers of a plan began to circulate. Outside the cabin, the preacher's influence had drawn a small council of trusted men together. They spoke in measured tones about what must be done, about precedent and protection, about morality cloaked in authority. Their words carried the rhythm of inevitability, a drumbeat of control that reached into every corner of the hollow. Decisions would be made, not by law, not by the mother's will, but by the valley itself. Subscribe now if you have not, and leave a comment with your town or village. Let the world know you are here, witnessing what unfolds. Some knowledge is a burden, but to bear it is also an act of defiance. Within the cabin, the mother pressed her lips to the twins' foreheads, murmuring assurances that life was not yet over. She knew the valley's judgment was coming, that the weight of superstition and authority was already shaping the choices of men and women beyond the walls. And in the quiet corners of the room, beneath the low lamplight, the twins slept, or at least they rested, blissfully unaware that the first seeds of a conspiracy had already been sown. By the end of the week, the valley had grown restless, its unease taking shape as deliberate action. The council of men, guided by the preacher's stern logic, convened in the back of the general store under flickering lanterns. Their whispers carried a gravity that made the walls themselves seem to lean closer. Each man knew the stakes. The twins were not merely two children fused unnaturally. They were a threat to the fragile order that governed still water. Fear had become doctrine, and doctrine demanded enforcement. Words were chosen carefully, measured, each syllable shaping the valley's inevitable response. The father, though silent, felt the presence of this judgment pressing in from all directions. He walked the ridge, eyes scanning the edges of the forest, ears straining for the faintest sound of movement among the pines. The mother, weak from sleepless nights and constant vigilance, cradled the twins, murmuring stories to them of rivers, sunlight, and warmth, a delicate defiance against the rising tide of dread. She knew that love alone might not save them, but it was all she could offer. Tiny shields of hope woven from her voice and her touch. The midwife observed quietly, noting the tension with a mixture of dread and fascination. Every movement, every glance, every half-whispered conversation in the village was a signal of the impending storm. She began to understand the subtle ways fear could manipulate even the strongest hearts, how communal belief could become a weapon as lethal as any blade. It was not the children who were unnatural, she realized, but the valley's response, the machinery of collective judgment grinding relentlessly toward its appointed conclusion. And so the stage was set. Men moved through the snow with purpose, carrying lanterns and tools that might just as easily defend as execute. Women whispered at doors and wells, spreading warnings and guidance, each word shaping the narrative that the twins were an omen, a danger, a signal of things that should not be allowed to live. Subscribe if you have not yet, and leave a comment telling where you listened from. Your presence matters, for every witness strengthens the fragile line between memory and erasure. Night fell, and the valley's silence was punctuated only by the distant, overlapping cries of the twins. The sound carried like wind through the hollows, threading fear into the hearts of those who had yet to see them. Within the cabin, the mother held the children close, feeling the pulse of life against her chest, knowing the valley's designs were gathering momentum, and somewhere in the shadows of still water, forces beyond understanding waited patiently, watching, shaping, and ensuring that the unfolding of this story would leave no soul untouched. That night, a hush fell over the valley, unnatural and expectant. Lanterns bobbed in the distance along the frozen paths, small sparks of human intention against the dark woods. The council, emboldened by the preacher's counsel and the doctor's cold assessment, approached the cabin with deliberate precision. They spoke little, their words swallowed by the wind, replaced by the rhythm of boots crunching against frozen earth, a cadence that carried both warning and inevitability. Inside, the mother sensed the tension, though she could not see it. The twins, nestled against her chest, whimpered softly in overlapping rhythms, each sound threading through her own pulse. She whispered to them in low tones, stories older than the mountains themselves, tales of birds returning in spring, rivers that never forget their paths, and shadows that sometimes bend to protection rather than harm. Each word was a tether, a fragile bulwark against the gathering dread beyond the cabin walls. The father stood near the hearth, lantern in hand, scanning the edges of the room. His jaw was tight, hands trembling with the weight of decision he had not chosen. The midwife, shadowed in the corner, felt a tightening in her chest. She had borne witness to countless births, yet never one where the very existence of children could provoke such orchestrated malice. Fear had become architecture here, built brick by brick, and she realized the twins were already trapped in a structure far taller than the cabin itself. Outside, the council paused, lifting lanterns to illuminate the frost. Their presence was a threat and a summons, a reminder that no amount of maternal vigilance could shield the twins from the machinery of the valley's judgment. The preacher's words had become law, the doctor's observations justification, and now the men were agents of a fate decided long before they arrived. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to anchor yourself in this story, to bear witness to what unfolds beyond these walls. Subscribe now if you have not, and leave your town in the comments. Each observer strengthens the record of a history that was meant to remain hidden. The first knock on the cabin door was deliberate, measured, almost ceremonial. The mother stiffened, clutching the twins closer. The father's hand hovered near the hearth, not for warmth, but for any defense he could muster. Inside, the air grew thick, almost tangible, as though the valley itself pressed into the room, bending shadows toward the mother and her children. The council's presence was immediate, undeniable, and a line had been crossed. The hollow was no longer merely observing. They had arrived to decide. The twins stirred, their cries overlapping, echoing through the cabin and out into the snow, a sound that carried defiance as much as fear. In still water, the first act of confrontation had begun, and the valley's shadow had fallen fully upon the family. The council's knocks had barely faded when a cold wind swept through the cabin, carrying with it a message of authority and inevitability. Outside, the men lingered, lanterns swaying, shadows stretching unnaturally across the snow. Inside, the mother held the twins tighter, feeling their small bodies tremble against her chest. Each breath they drew was fragile, yet defiant, as if their very existence contested the valley's orchestrated fear. The father moved toward the door, knowing confrontation was inevitable, knowing that negotiation had been replaced by expectation. The preacher's voice, muffled but carried through the winter air, reached the cabin in whispered authority. The valley speaks. Mercy is not always in living. Sometimes it is in obedience. Sometimes it is in silence. The words wrapped around the room like chains. The mother's heart thumped in frantic rhythm with the overlapping cries of her children. She whispered assurances to them, words meant to shield, but even she knew that outside, the machinery of judgment was relentless. Inside the cabin, the midwife's face was pale, lines etched deeper by the weight of knowledge. She had delivered infants that bore strange markings, limbs that bent unnaturally, and yet never had she been faced with a threat so entirely psychological. The valley had become a living entity, its collective will pressing against the fragile walls of the cabin, infiltrating minds with doubt, fear, and an unquestioned authority. The twins were no longer merely children. They had become symbols, triggers for a fear that had long been cultivated, nurtured, and weaponized. The father's hands shook as he held the latch. He realized, with a cold clarity, that the hollow's influence extended far beyond the men outside. Every glance exchanged by neighbors, every whispered conjecture at the well or the store, reinforced the inevitability of what the council intended. His love for the children was real, but even love had limits when pitted against the entire valley's design. Type, the veil is broken. Twice in the comments to mark yourself as a witness. Subscribe now and leave your location to cement your presence in the story. Every eye observing this history adds a tether to reality, preventing the valley's silence from swallowing truth entirely. The night deepened, and the council's decision was no longer abstract. It was imminent. The first direct threats were whispered against the cabin walls, subtle, deliberate, a choreography of intimidation. "It is not cruelty," one man murmured. "It is preservation. It is righteousness." The mother's lips moved in silent protest. The father's eyes searched the darkened forest for an escape that did not exist. And the twins, oblivious to the valley's machinations, slept, or perhaps plotted their own survival in the rhythm of their overlapping heartbeats, defying the world that sought to erase them before it even understood them. By the next evening, Stillwater had transformed from a quiet valley into a theater of suspense. Lanterns flickered in windows like watchful eyes, and the crunch of boots across frozen soil became a rhythm that seemed to haunt the mother's every step. The council had decided their course, their whispers had hardened into instruction, and the first tangible pressures were about to be applied. Every word, every glance, every motion from the neighbors outside was a calculated act, a signal that the twins' fate was no longer in the hands of their parents alone. Inside, the mother moved cautiously, cradling the children as if she could shield them from the invisible weight pressing against the cabin. Each cry of the twins reverberated through the timbers, overlapping like a warning no one could ignore. The father remained near the hearth, hands clenched, knuckles white. His eyes darted toward the window and toward the dark line of the ridge, aware that every shadow could carry judgment, that every visitor could carry finality. Fear had become physical, settling in the marrow of their bones, in the air they breathed. The midwife, ever vigilant, moved quietly among them, documenting each moment, each irregular pulse, each cry that overlapped unnaturally. She whispered to herself, drawing a fragile line between observation and complicity. Science and superstition collided here, and she felt the precarious balance snap with every passing hour. The twins were alive, yes, but the valley's control, silent and deliberate, threatened to shape not just their survival, but the meaning of their existence itself. The council arrived once more, now with instruments of authority and subtle intimidation, lanterns, sticks, even a small saw borrowed from the general store, not for violence, but as symbols, reminders that control was tangible. "It is not cruelty," one elder said, voice low. "It is responsibility. It is order." Their words, rehearsed and unwavering, pressed like the cold wind against the cabin walls, carrying the threat of collective action, the weight of communal certainty. Subscribe now, if you have not, and leave your location in the comments. Let your voice stand as witness to events that were never meant to be seen. Every observer is a thread in the fabric of memory, binding truth against the tide of silence. The mother pressed the twins closer, murmuring soft assurances, yet even her whispers could not mask the reality. The valley's design was closing in, shaping the future with every shadowed glance, every calculated step. The father's resolve wavered as he realized the twins were no longer just his responsibility. They were a symbol, a test, and perhaps a danger in the eyes of those whose judgment he had long relied upon. And as the council loomed just outside, the air hung heavy with inevitability. The first act of the valley's enforcement poised to unfold before the night was done. The night stretched long and oppressive, shadows thickening against the cabin walls, each one a silent emissary of the valley's scrutiny. Outside, the council lingered, their presence more psychological than physical, each step a metronome counting down inevitability. The mother moved between hearth and cradle, whispering lullabies that had once soothed generations, now carrying a defiance that was almost tangible. Every word she spoke to the twins was a shield, each syllable a small act of rebellion against the collective will pressing upon them. The father, meanwhile, paced near the doorway, hands curling and uncurling, as if to grasp an escape that did not exist. He could feel the valley's judgment pressing through the timbers, through the frost-sealed windows, through the very air he breathed. Even the familiar walls of his home, once a sanctuary, now seemed complicit, amplifying the weight of expectation. Every decision he made felt insufficient, yet every inaction was an admission of submission. Fear had become a currency here, and the father, however reluctant, was learning its cost. The midwife hovered silently, her eyes scanning each twitch of the twins' tiny limbs, each overlapping cry. She was recording not only their physical state, but the subtle ways the valley's influence seeped into their lives. In every glance from the windows, in every hushed conversation beyond the door, she saw the mechanisms of control at work. Fear, she realized, was not only in the minds of the council. It had been etched into the valley itself, a lattice of authority that threatened to cage these children before they had a chance to live. Type, the veil is broken, twice in the comments to anchor yourself in this unfolding history. Subscribe now and leave your town to mark your presence as a witness. Every observer is a line in the ledger against erasure, a tether holding this story from disappearing entirely. The council's first direct interference came as a quiet knock, almost polite, almost casual, but heavy with purpose. The father froze, the mother's heart skipped, and the twins stirred, sensing something beyond their understanding. The men's instructions were subtle but firm: monitor the children, restrict their exposure, let the valley's judgment seep into every corner of their existence. It was not an act of immediate violence, but it was violence nonetheless. A calculated pressure designed to bend reality around the twins, to normalize fear and prepare the family for eventual compliance. Within the cabin, the mother pressed her lips to the children's crowns, whispering that they were more than fear, more than prophecy. She knew the valley's power was formidable, but even in that oppressive night, she held a fragile truth: the children's lives were theirs to protect, even if the world outside refused to understand. The shadows of still water waited patiently, but for the first time, so did their resistance. By the following dawn, the valley had awakened with a silent deliberation, as though every tree, every ridge, every frozen creek had conspired overnight to shape the twins' fate. The neighbors' whispers had gained texture, turning into instructions carried from porch to porch, from well to storehouse, each word a subtle reinforcement of the valley's design. It was no longer simply the council acting, it was the collective will of still water, woven into the very consciousness of the community. Fear had become infrastructure, and the family at the center was its first occupant. Inside the cabin, the mother moved with quiet determination, attending to the twins while listening to the murmur of the valley beyond the walls. Every footstep outside, every scrape of a boot on frozen ground, became a metronome of anxiety, a signal that judgment was immediate and unrelenting. She whispered stories of light and survival, crafting a shield of narrative, even as the father's resolve continued to fray. His hands trembled as he lifted buckets of water from the frozen creek, his eyes flicking toward the shadows that seemed to stalk him as much as the twins. Every glance from the neighbors' windows felt like accusation, every passing figure a silent juror. The midwife, observing quietly, began to understand the depth of the valley's machinery. She had witnessed fear, yes, but this was something more, a psychological architecture so complete that even those who wished no harm were compelled to participate. The twins' cries, overlapping and haunting, were now a pulse running through the community, a rhythm that dictated thought, decision, and action. The valley's power was subtle yet omnipresent, bending perception, twisting judgment, and reinforcing its own inevitability. Subscribe now and leave your location in the comments. Let your presence be a witness to this story, for every observer adds a line to the ledger that history sought to erase. And within the cabin, cracks began to appear in the father's composure. The weight of the valley's judgment pressed not only on him but through him, seeping into decisions he could not undo. The council's subtle threats, neighbors' whispers, and the preacher's lingering influence had built a cage around him, psychological, social, and moral. Each day, the twins' fragile existence became a mirror reflecting his own weaknesses, and he wondered whether compliance was survival or surrender. Yet the mother remained resolute. She pressed her lips to the fused crowns of the twins, murmuring defiance into the night. They were not omens, nor errors, nor warnings, they were life. And within her defiance, within the heartbeat of her whispered words, the first traces of resistance began to take form, a force that would test the valley's authority and challenge the very design of still water. By mid-morning, still water had become a silent jury, its verdict unspoken but universally understood. Word of the three-headed twins had spread beyond the immediate ridge, carried by travelers and neighbors who could no longer ignore the anomaly. Rumors grew faster than the snow melted in spring. Some claimed that strangers passing through the hollow had glimpsed the cabin from the road, shadows moving strangely in the windows. Others insisted they had heard the overlapping cries themselves, a sound so unnatural it made their teeth ache and their blood chill. The valley was no longer only a psychological prison. It was a beacon drawing curiosity, fear, and latent hostility from beyond. Inside the cabin, the mother's vigilance never faltered. Each cry of the twins, each movement under her careful swaddling, was a reminder of the stakes. She whispered stories to them, a litany of survival and cunning, teaching them in murmurs the rhythm of life in a world that sought to erase them. She pressed her lips to their fused foreheads, as if to impart her strength directly into the fragile junction of bone and breath. The father watched silently, his own heart a battlefield. Love, fear, and shame collided within him. Each time he looked at the twins, he saw both innocence and threat, a mirror of the valley's own contradictory gaze. The council reconvened that evening, this time with eyes sharper, movements more deliberate. They spoke of outsiders, of potential discovery, of shame that could ripple through the valley like wildfire. The hollow cannot harbor such anomalies. One man whispered, "They will draw eyes we cannot control." Every word carried an authority beyond individual judgment. It was as though the valley itself had conspired to speak through their mouths. The father's hands trembled. Every instinct screamed for protection, but every ounce of social pressure pressed him toward compliance. He realized that defiance might cost not only the twins' lives, but his own standing, his family's place, his sense of self. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to anchor yourself in this story. Subscribe now and leave your town in the comments to cement your presence in this forbidden history. Every witness strengthens the record against erasure. The midwife's eyes darted nervously toward the door. She had delivered life countless times, but never had she seen life so contested, so ensnared in fear, suspicion, and obligation. The twins slept fitfully, their small bodies rising and falling in a rhythm of overlapping hearts, a heartbeat of rebellion no one could yet fully understand. Outside, shadows pressed closer, lanterns flickered over frozen ground, and the first stirrings of action loomed. The valley was preparing to act, and the cabin, once a sanctuary, had become the stage upon which mercy and terror would collide. As dusk fell over still water, the valley seemed to exhale, a slow, deliberate breath that carried tension and expectation alike. Lanterns swung outside, throwing fractured light across the snow, while the council's presence became more insistent, their movements choreographed to remind the family of the inevitable. Every sound, the crack of a branch, the scrape of a boot, even the faint whistle of the wind, seemed to echo with purpose. Inside, the mother pressed herself to the twins, feeling their fragile warmth against the cold certainty of the world beyond the walls. The father paced near the hearth, the rhythm of his steps reflecting the turmoil inside. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, the trap into which they had been drawn. The valley's pressure was no longer merely psychological. It had begun to shape reality. The whispers that once passed behind hands now directed action, orchestrating a slow encroachment upon the cabin's fragile defenses. One neighbor lingered too long near the edge of the clearing, another carried a lantern with careful deliberation, its beam sweeping the snow as if to measure compliance. The twins, oblivious to such calculations, stirred and whimpered, their cries layering atop each other in haunting harmony. The midwife knelt beside the mother, her fingers brushing against the swaddled forms, silently offering both comfort and counsel. She understood now that the valley's design was total, a network of influence so complete that even the father, once the arbiter of his home, could not act without acknowledging the omnipresent judgment. Fear had become codified, ritualized, woven into the very architecture of the community. It was not enough that the twins survived. The valley demanded proof that survival was acceptable, that defiance could be contained, that anomaly could be tamed, or extinguished. Subscribe now and leave your location in the comments. Your voice is a witness, a tether to truth, a defiance against the erasure the valley has long perfected. Every observer adds weight to memory, ensuring that even the most hidden histories cannot vanish entirely. The council finally approached the cabin door. Their knocks were deliberate, almost ceremonial. Inside, the mother felt her breath tighten in her chest. The father's body coiled with both fear and desperation. The shadows cast by the lanterns moved like fingers across the walls, pressing the family toward a decision already made for them. Outside, the valley waited, patient and unyielding, demanding obedience, shaping fear into action, preparing to claim what it believed could not exist. And yet, in the small cluster of heat and breath, the mother whispered to the twins, life persists. Even in the face of inevitability, even under the weight of collective will, the pulse of existence cannot be silenced so easily. The knocking at the door grew louder, sharper, each rap a reminder that the valley's judgment was no longer abstract but imminent. The father's hands shook as he approached, knowing instinctively that this was the culmination of weeks of whispered deliberation and silent observation. The mother pressed the twins closer, their overlapping cries now a fragile shield against the world outside. He could see the faces of the council members through the narrow cracks of the door, eyes steely, movements measured, conviction unwavering. Their presence demanded compliance, and yet every fiber of his being wrestled with instinct and fear. Inside, the cabin felt impossibly small, the air thick with cold and anxiety. The mother murmured soft encouragements to the twins, her voice a thin but unbreakable line of resistance. She whispered their names into the night, each syllable an anchor against the tide of inevitability. You are more than their fear. You are more than their judgment, she said, as if speaking the words might alter reality itself. The midwife stood nearby, her hands folded, torn between the desire to shield the children and the understanding that any action might provoke the valley's collective wrath. The council finally entered, not with violence, but with a measured authority that made the cabin itself seem complicit. They spoke quietly, each phrase loaded with implication, a carefully rehearsed script designed to erode resistance without overt confrontation. We are here to guide, not to harm, one elder intoned. Yet the message was clear. Survival would come at a cost, compliance would be exacted, and defiance carried consequences that extended far beyond the cabin's walls. The father's resolve wavered under the weight of eyes that seemed to see not only his actions but his soul. Subscribe now and leave your location in the comments. Every voice raised against the shadow of silence strengthens the record of what was never meant to be seen. Witnessing is an act of defiance, a way to preserve the pulse of forbidden truth. The mother, sensing the tension coiling around the father, pressed herself further into the twins' fragile forms, whispering that life persisted even when the world sought to dictate its value. The council watched, calculating, as the father struggled between instinct and imposed morality. In that moment, the cabin became a crucible. Outside, the valley waited patient, knowing that fear could shape action, that collective will could bend the strongest hearts. And inside, a mother whispered defiance into the overlapping breaths of her children, a rebellion so quiet it could barely be heard, yet potent enough to challenge the valley's inexorable designs. Night had settled into the valley like a suffocating shroud. The cabin, once a private refuge, now felt like a small island surrounded by the encroaching tide of still water's scrutiny. Lanterns cast jagged shadows through the frost-lined windows, illuminating faces hardened by collective resolve. The father sat heavily near the hearth, his shoulders slumped, as if carrying not only the weight of the twins, but the entire valley upon them. Every instinct urged him to protect. Yet every glance toward the council reminded him that defiance came at a perilous price. The mother, seated on the floor beside the swaddled forms, whispered in a voice both tender and defiant. Her lips traced the contours of their fused foreheads as if imprinting a shield directly onto their skin. "You belong to life, not fear," she murmured, each word a talisman against the mounting tide of judgment outside. Her eyes darted to the door, sensing the valley's vigilance in every movement beyond the cabin walls. She could feel their presence like a cold wind pressing through the cracks of the home, testing her resolve, measuring her will against the invisible authority of collective fear. The midwife, once silent and detached, now observed with acute awareness. She saw the valley's mechanisms, how fear had become infrastructure, how whispers dictated behavior, and how the council's subtle manipulations were reinforced by every neighbor, every passerby, every silent observer. The twins, innocent and unaware, had become symbols, vessels through which the valley asserted its invisible control. Every overlapping cry, every minute twitch of their bodies, resonated beyond the cabin, feeding the machinery of authority, bending the father toward compliance. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to anchor yourself in the gravity of this history. Subscribe now and leave your location. Your presence a tether against the erasure that shadows this story. Outside, the council's strategies grew more insistent. They encouraged surveillance, subtle admonitions, and calculated conversations meant to isolate the family further. Even the children's minor movements were scrutinized, every small gesture measured against the valley's collective moral compass. The father's inner struggle intensified. He could no longer distinguish between instinct and obligation, between protection and submission. And yet, within this oppressive atmosphere, the mother's defiance radiated like a fragile flame. She whispered stories, imbued with courage and cunning, planting in the twins a rhythm of survival that transcended the valley's calculated fear. In that small, fragile cabin, life persisted against the weight of judgment, teaching the first lessons of resilience and quiet rebellion to beings too young to comprehend the storm surrounding them. By the following morning, the valley's reach extended further than the cabin walls. Travelers and traders passing through still water had caught fragments of the story. The overlapping cries, the whispered tales of three heads upon one body, and brought them back like sparks to tinder. Rumors twisted and grew with every telling, spreading faster than snowmelt in the spring thaw. Outsiders, curious or fearful, began to linger near the edges of the hollow, their gazes piercing the isolation the family had once taken for granted. Fear had now become contagious, infecting not only the residents but anyone who wandered too close to the story, the valley's invisible grip extending like roots beneath the frost. Inside the cabin, the mother sensed the encroachment immediately. Every noise beyond the walls, every distorted shadow through the frost-crusted window, carried the threat of intrusion. She whispered soft reassurances to the twins, pressing them close, their tiny heads fused into a singular, fragile crown of defiance. "They cannot touch you," she murmured, though the words felt almost ceremonial against the growing tide of external interest. The father's anxiety had deepened. Each step he took outside felt like a betrayal, a compromise between survival and the imperative to protect. His soul, once bound by simple toil and family duty, was now ensnared in a far greater design, a design orchestrated by the valley, the council, and the curiosity of the unknown. The midwife observed quietly, realizing that the threat was no longer abstract. Outsiders carried the weight of possibility, the potential for exploitation, ridicule, or worse. And yet, they had no true understanding of the fragile lives within the cabin. The twins, unaware of the political and psychological machinations surrounding them, stirred and cried. their overlapping voices an uncanny testament to life persisting in defiance of expectation. Subscribe now and leave your location in the comments. Mark yourself a witness to history that the valley tried to erase. Every voice raised against the tide of silence strengthens the memory of those who cannot yet speak for themselves. Outside, the council's influence converged with the intrusion of the outsiders, creating a maelstrom of pressure that threatened to shatter the father's resolve entirely. They urged surveillance, subtly implied consequences, and reinforced the weight of communal judgment, all while maintaining the illusion of righteousness. Yet within the cabin, the mother's whispers, the warmth pressed against fused foreheads, and the rhythmic breaths of the twins formed a countercurrent. A quiet rebellion, a lesson that survival was as much about defiance as it was about endurance. That night, a cold wind swept down from the ridges, carrying with it the murmurs of the valley and the scent of smoke from distant hearths. Lanterns bobbed in the shadows outside the cabin, moving with intent, as if the valley itself had taken shape in human form. The council, bolstered by outsiders drawn in by curiosity and fear, approached with silent coordination, their presence a quiet declaration. Compliance was no longer optional. The father stood at the threshold, every muscle taut, knowing that in the moments to come, the fragile line between protection and surrender would be tested. Inside, the mother pressed the twins to her chest, their fused heads rising and falling with the rhythm of life and defiance. Her eyes were fierce in the lantern light, reflecting the determination of someone who understood that surrender would mean the destruction of all she held sacred. She whispered their names softly, murmuring lessons of resilience she hoped they would absorb, even without understanding. "You are more than what they see," she said, each word a fragile barrier against the encroaching authority. Every breath, every heartbeat became a ritual, a shield against the tide of collective judgment pressing against the cabin walls. The midwife hovered near the door, her hands trembling, caught between instinct to protect and the knowledge of the consequences of interference. She had witnessed countless births, each carrying its own burden, but none so fraught with the intersection of fear, superstition, and communal control. The twins, innocent in their fused complexity, were now the focal point of a psychological siege that threatened to dismantle both body and spirit. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to anchor yourself in this forbidden history. Subscribe now and leave your town in the comments. Your presence a testament that memory cannot be extinguished. The first knock at the cabin door was deliberate, heavy with authority. Shadows fell across the walls like fingers probing for weakness. The father's resolve wavered as the council members' voices filtered through the threshold, coaxing, warning, asserting the necessity of action. "It is mercy," one said quietly, though every word carried the weight of judgment. The mother's grip tightened, a silent rebuke, and in that tension, the cabin became a crucible. Outside, the valley waited, patient and unyielding, confident in its own righteousness. Inside, life clung stubbornly to the smallest pulse, teaching the first lessons of courage against a world determined to impose fear. The council's presence pressed closer, their shadows stretching like tendrils across the cabin floor. Each footfall outside echoed with authority, a rhythm that drove tension into every corner. The father's hands were clammy on the hearth, knuckles white, as he measured the impossible, the preservation of his children against the totality of a community that had decided their fate. The mother's arms remained wrapped tightly around the twins, their fused heads trembling with the subtle, uncanny rhythm of life. Her eyes met his, a silent challenge: "Do you yield, or do you stand with me?" The first voice came from the threshold, low and deliberate, cloaked in the veneer of reason. "It is for their own good," one council member said. "You cannot allow them to suffer, nor the valley to be cursed by their existence." Every syllable carried the weight of inevitability, a psychological lever pressed against the father's resolve. Yet the mother's whispers cut through the tension like a blade through fog. "They are ours," she murmured, pressing the fragile forms to her chest. Her defiance was not loud, it was a quiet, implacable force, a refusal to surrender even as fear and authority converged. The midwife moved silently, her gaze flicking from the council to the children, understanding that the tension was no longer merely moral or social. It had become physical, a prelude to the violence the valley demanded. The twins stirred, their overlapping cries a haunting counterpoint to the murmurs of those outside, a living testament that life could not be fully dominated by superstition or fear. Every heartbeat of the fused children resonated like a drumbeat against the valley's imposed will. Subscribe now and leave your location in the comments. Every observer becomes a witness, a tether to truth in the face of erasure, a guard against histories the valley tried to bury. Suddenly, a hand reached for the cabin door, the wood creaking under deliberate pressure. The father instinctively moved to intercept, yet the mother's fierce grip held him back, eyes blazing with defiance. The moment was suspended, a delicate balance between aggression and protection, judgment and mercy. Outside, the valley held its collective breath, confident in its dominance. Inside, life clung to the smallest pulse, the tiniest breath, teaching that courage often resides not in armies or councils, but in a mother's unyielding embrace of the fragile, the anomalous, the forbidden. The cabin door shuddered under the council's insistence, but it did not yield. Inside, the mother's arms tightened around the twins, their fused heads resting against her chest, each tiny breath a pulse of defiance. The father stood frozen and torn between instinct and the moral gravity imposed by the valley. The council members exchanged glances, their authority absolute, yet here in this small, frail space, it faltered against a force they could not measure: love, instinct, and the raw resilience of life. Outside, the valley waited as if time itself had slowed, every family, every neighbor, every shadow poised to witness the outcome. Fear had been their weapon, superstition their armor, but it could not penetrate the simple truth that within the cabin life, strange, uncanny, fused, persisted. The mother whispered to the twins, words half prayer, half promise. You will see the sun. You will hear the wind. You will exist because I exist. Each syllable was a tether between the fragile and the infinite, a declaration that some truths cannot be erased by collective will. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within yourself. Subscribe now and leave your town, for every voice that witnesses this forbidden history strengthens it against the shadows of erasure. The council, sensing their power tested, faltered in coordinated steps. The father's hesitation became an anchor for defiance. The mother's unwavering presence, the twins' quiet persistence, and the midwife's silent understanding created a triangle of resistance against the machinery of the valley. What had been a siege became a reckoning of perception versus reality, fear versus courage. The world outside demanded compliance, conformity, and silence. But inside, life had a different rhythm, one that no council, rumor, or superstition could command. By dawn, the valley's whispers had grown into murmurings of awe rather than fear. The council left, not in defeat, but with the recognition that not all things can be bent to collective will. The mother remained, her arms the only sanctuary the twins had ever known. Their three-headed presence, once a symbol of dread, had transformed into a testament that even in the most oppressive environments, defiance can survive, hope can endure, and life, however unnatural it may appear to some, will persist. The hollow still holds its secrets, and the cabin, now empty of the council's shadow, echoes with the memory of that night. The twins' cries, overlapping and haunting, remind us that some histories are never fully erased, and that courage, even in its quietest forms, reshapes the world.